Welcome back to another conversation on South Carolina history, and today I'm going to talk about immigration, or how folks came to South Carolina, and today's talk will primarily be about European immigration, although I will mention some called Native Americans and those who came in chains from West Africa. Back in the 1990s, when I was doing some research on immigration, I found a book and a comment by another historian, and he said, "I was struck by a realization that I found both instructive and amusing. To track back through the number of progenitors of a present-day person means doubling the number of contributory mothers and fathers in each bygone generation. Thus, tracing back, in his case he was going 15 generations, and historians consider 25 years to be a historic generation. That person would have had 32,768 men and women contributing to his bloodline or her bloodline at that date." I want you to think about that. 1670, those who claim descent from first settlers of South Carolina. That was 14 generations ago, which means they have 16,384 people contributing to their bloodline. Now, most people don't track 16,000 bloodlines, they track one. But that just shows you how varied one's DNA might be. And if you want to go to those snooty Virginians in 1607, they have 131,072 direct forebears. So, with that in mind, the quote by Franklin D. Roosevelt in addressing the DAR at a convention in the 1930s said, "Good morning, descendants of my fellow immigrants." Everybody of European extraction is descended from an immigrant at some time or another. In the beginning, though, prior to European settlement, and thanks to the USC's Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at the Topper site in the Savannah River Valley, we know that there was human habitation here in South Carolina as early as 13,000 BCE. That's 15,000 years ago. These humans predate what we now refer to as Native Americans by some 5,000 years. So even those in South Carolina who now say they are Native Americans really were not the first here. They know they moved in from other areas of the Southwest. The first fiber-tempered pottery found in North America has been dated back to 2500 BCE, also in the Savannah River site. People of the woodland horizon immigrated into South Carolina, what is now South Carolina, about 1000 to 1500 BCE. So this is how we're talking about there was somebody here 15,000 years ago. But those who now claim to be Native Americans, and that's the term we use, or indigenous peoples is another term, they actually immigrated here as well. Around 1100 Common Era, a different group of immigrants, the Mississippians, moved here and established the nation of Cofitachique over near Mulberry Plantation on the Wateree River. They were hostile to the Woodlands people, and both began to decline with the first European contact in DeSoto. So before we get to the first waves of European migration in the 16th century, there were at least two, perhaps three waves of immigrants into what is now South Carolina. And there was one post-settlement Indian nation coming into South Carolina in 1684, and that was the Yamasee. They were invited to settle here by South Carolina's government to protect them from the Spaniards. The Spaniards were the first Europeans here, didn't last permanently, but they explored and settled South Carolina between 1521 and 1587, built their little capital, Santa Elena, the first capital of the Spanish province of La Florida. So don't believe anything you hear at St. Augustine about the capital of Spanish Florida. The first capital of the Spanish province of Florida was Santa Elena, which is the sites on Paris Island here. The Spanish government encouraged immigration from Spain, promising fertile land, free passage, farm animals, and a financial subsidy. And this is something that we're going to find in common throughout South Carolina's history. A government, whether it is Spanish or English or South Carolina, is going to use some kind of incentive to get people to come here, to move here. And in Spain's case, by 1580 they had a little town. There were artisans, there were farmers, but as you know, when Spain began to pull back its empire in the 1560s, they abandoned Santa Elena. And we move fast forward to the 1660s when King Charles II made his incredible land grant to 8 men to begin the province of South Carolina. Now, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, written by John Locke and Lord Anthony Ashley, are often misunderstood, particularly by political scientists. They've been characterized as a medieval monstrosity. They were impractical, they were visionary. In reality, the fundamental constitutions were a recruiting device. They were designed to lure settlers, immigrants, from the continent as well as the British Isles and the English West Indian colonies. And the biggest lure that was promised was land. Now, today we think, 50 acres of land, what was that? Well, many English country gentlemen would be delighted to have 50 acres of land or 100 acres of land. But South Carolina was offering more than that under the proprietors. Any adult free male was guaranteed 150 acres of land. And let's just say you were coming over with your family and you happen to have one boy who was 18 years of age. Well, he counts as an adult, so you get an extra 150 acres of land. And if you would happen to be bringing 2 enslaved persons with you, you get another 150 acres for each one of those. For every female you brought in, you got 100 acres. Now this was later reduced to 50 acres from 150, but still, that's an incredible amount of land to get people over here. Religious freedom was also a lure. It's often debated, but basically any person who believed in God was welcomed in South Carolina, except for Roman Catholics. That was quite clear. That reflects politics back home. And political participation, if you own 50 acres of land, which you could get for coming out here as an adult white male, you could vote. So it was close to universal white male suffrage. The proprietors printed 15 different promotional tracts, which they distributed throughout Europe. Those in Dublin emphasized economic opportunities and freedom of conscience. More than 1/3 of these promotional pamphlets were in French, and they were designed to attract French Protestants, many of whom were penniless refugees living in Switzerland, some of the German Palatine states, and of course in the Netherlands. The Huguenots, as they were called, responded to the advertisements, and hundreds immigrated to South Carolina. That would later produce a backlash because in some areas of the colony they were the majority of the population and elected members of the General Assembly. And as a precursor to immigration complaints today, the fact that these people were granted all the rights, powers, privileges, and immunities which any person born of English parentage may claim. And the complaint was, shall these Frenchmen who do not speak our language make our laws? And so what the Colonial Assembly did was, okay, Craven County, where you live, has a majority French population. We're going to change that. We're going to merge Craven County with Berkeley County so that the English will be able to outvote you, which, of course, they did. The proprietors' welcoming immigration policies for Huguenots and others worked. In 1708, that's just a historic generation now after the first settlement, getting into the second historic generation. The Reverend Gideon Johnson reported that the people here, generally speaking, are a perfect medley or hodgepodge, who have transported themselves hither from Bermudas, Jamaica, Barbados, Montserrat, Antigua, that would be Nevis today, New England, Pennsylvania, etc., etc., etc. And that he did have several et ceteras. He sounded like the King of Siam, but etc., etc., etc. But that hodgepodge of Europeans neglected to mention the largest portion of the population, the enslaved, because by 1708, South Carolina had a black majority. So as we look through this question of immigration from 1670, or actually 15,000 BC to the present, you're going to find that successive governments have used a variety of tools in order to attract settlers. Now, those Europeans who came represent at least 14 different European ethnicities. That's kind of staggering. People think of South Carolina as an English colony. No, it's not. And we need to think of how we subdivide even those who came. Let's just say you were English. Fine. You were English in ancestry, but what if you come from one of the Caribbean islands? You were Anglo-Caribbean. You had a totally different perspective on an English person who migrated from New England, and they did, Puritan congregations. Dorchester, the little town of Dorchester, was settled by Puritans from Dorchester, Massachusetts. Boy, that's so sound mouthful. Dorchester, Massachusetts. Or somebody from Yorkshire, or somebody from Cornwall. Quite different. And by the end of the colonial period, people of English descent comprised just 36% of the white population. Just 36%. The next largest group was the Scots, with 33%. And then there were the Irish at about 12%, the Welsh at 9%, German at 5%, Dutch at about less than 1%, about 0.5%, the French at 4%, Swedish at about 0.5%, Italians, they were Italian Swiss, and this is something that's only recently been discovered, but we knew we had a number of settlers who were French Swiss or German Swiss. Well, Switzerland does have Italian-speaking cantons right in the mix of all of those. And thanks to Professor Larry Rowland of USCB, he's tracked several early land grants in what's now Beaufort County to people who were Italian Swiss who came over here. And then, of course, there was South Carolina's relatively large Jewish population, not measured in terms of percentage, but in terms of numbers, quite impressive. The largest Jewish population of any colony in British North America, and that held true until the 1820s, the largest Jewish population of any state in the country. And Charleston had the largest Jewish population of any city. So all of that tells you that, yes, we did have an incredible mixture of folks here coming to South Carolina. And my students used to often say, well, what are some of the names of people descended? And these are not complete. These are just some examples. Irish, McRae, Wilson, Lemon, Presley, Plowden. Dutch, Van Drost, Rhett, the famous Robert Bowman, but that's a Dutch name. French. Now, you know here in South Carolina we don't pronounce our French names the way they do it in France. Bufane Street in Charleston. Porcher, Horry, UG, Manigault, Prelo, Desesseur, Girard, and Marion. You know, you talk to someone from France and you say Bufane, they just go, well, Beaufort. It's Beaufort in North Carolina, which, by the way, is the way an Englishman using that family name would do it. But, you know, we pronounce things the way we want to here. In German, Carl Tyson, Theus, the great portrait painter, Jeremiah Theus was German. Giger. Germans would pronounce it Geiger, but we call it Giger. Germans who went to Virginia in the same time that the Giegers came here pronounced it in Virginia Geiger. Amaker, Ziegler, Wanamaker, Sheely, Inhabitant, Boozer. Look at the directories in Orangeburg, Lexington, Lawrence, Calhoun County. Scots, Pringle, Buchanan, Kinlaw, Days, Abercrombie, Allen. Scots-Irish, and they are not ethnically different, but certainly have a different background from folks who come from mainland Scotland, particularly Highland Scots. But they were an important ingredient in certainly the backcountry population. Calhoun, Caldwell, Jackson, Bratton, Adams, Moore, Montgomery, and Wardlaw. And then there are the Welch, who settled over in the PD, the area we now call the Welch Neck. And they came from Delaware, then considered that was the lower three counties of Pennsylvania. Name James, Vaughn, Pawleys Island, that's a Welch name. Amon, Vaughn, and Fickling. Now, I don't have the Swedish names. That came from a study done by people at the Colonial Williamsburg Institute. But they were from Delaware as well. What originally were those lower three counties of Pennsylvania, Delaware, had been New Sweden. A brief time when Sweden tried to establish a colony in North America. So they migrated down here with some of those good Welsh Baptists and settled over in the PD. And then Jewish names that go back 3 centuries, Cohen, Tobias, and DaCosta. So that's just a sampling of the European diversity that was here in South Carolina. Now, what brought all of these people after the proprietors are gone in 1719, good riddance, what brought everybody else out here? Because South Carolina, although very attractive seemingly, was known as a death trap. And people died here like crazy. And it wasn't until late in the 18th century that the number of natural births exceeded deaths. So immigration is what fueled the growth of colonial South Carolina. Well, the new royal government in the 1730s and 1740s developed something it called the Township Plan. It created a series of 11 townships, organized settlements, 60 miles inland, and basically it was a defensive ring around Charleston and the Low Country. The idea was to attract these immigrants and put them on the frontier to keep out the Spaniards and the Native Americans. That was the original plan. Each settler was to receive 50 acres for every family member including servants and slaves. So again, that's a very attractive lure. And the General Assembly also provided funds for transportation, food, and tools. And quit rents, which were a nominal sum that had to be paid by everybody who owned land, were waived for 10 years. So again, this is South Carolina's government involved in paying people, basically, to come here, to bring it's the land. Now, this was not an inexpensive venture. It was costly, particularly when you're saying you're going to help funds for transportation, food, tools. Well, guess how they paid for it? They slapped an import duty on slaves, on enslaved persons. So yes, the township system was going to protect the Lowcountry planters, but they're going to have to end up paying for it with an import duty slapped on persons brought in here, enslavement. The township plan also was to increase the white population. The colonial government was very concerned about the black majority. And so they said, okay, we'll have the import tariff and we'll bring in new settlers. Maybe that will help redress the population imbalance, something that they discussed quite openly in the assembly. For a while, it did slow down the importation of enslaved persons, but it didn't stop the flow. So that by the time you get to the end of the colonial period, South Carolina's population is 60% black, 40% white. Now, the distribution of that depends upon where one lived. If you lived in the Georgetown area or the Beaufort area, you're going to find the African American population is approaching 80 to 85%, and there are only a handful of enslaved persons in like York County, or what we now call York County, or Spartan District. So the township plan. Now, a number of these townships became ethnic magnets for immigrants. Saxagatha, Orangeburg, and London Borough became overwhelmingly German. And what happened is that once a group got settled in the area, they did write home, or when people would land in Charleston, they would look for, well, where are folks that speak the same language I do? And so those areas, like what we now think of as Calhoun, Orangeburg, Lexington, Lawrence, Newberry counties, attracted a majority of German immigrants. Amelia and New Windsor, about a 1/3 to 1/2 German, and Hillsborough and Purisborough, or Purisburg, were a French majority, and Queensborough over in the PD was Welsh. Now, the government was still concerned about we need to have more white settlers. And so they passed the Bounty Act in 1761. The government of South Carolina paid individuals a bounty to import poor Protestants into the colony. Now, what that meant was if the money didn't go to the immigrants, the money went to the immigrant supplier, as it was. And 4,000 most Irish, but also a few Germans and English, were brought in under this Bounty Act. And again, this particular initiative was paid for by an extra income duty on enslaved persons being brought here. Now, the Bounty Act was abused. One thing they had to do, there were poor Protestants. Well, if you've got a ship coming from Ireland, do you think they're all going to be poor Protestants? No. Well, the captain and whoever was selling or collecting the immigrants, attested to the fact, yes, these are all poor Irish. They're not Catholics. Well, we now know that, yes, there were a lot of Catholics there who worshiped in silence and in private, but also the conditions on these ships, as Henry Lawrence said, who was primarily a slave trader, he said the conditions on these immigrant ships were equal to or worse than those on slave ships. Because it became a scandal, one ship arrived with half the people who had died. The Bounty Act was eventually repealed, but again, it's a government initiative to try to bring in more settlers. But throughout the colonial period, the generous land grants and religious toleration attracted settlers from the British Isles and other American colonies. Beginning in the 1740s, the Scots-Irish left Pennsylvania, heading south along the Great Wagon Road, which of course goes through the Shenandoah Valley into the Piedmont of the Carolinas, passes by near Winston-Salem, and the Great Wagon Road ended pretty much in Lancaster County, South Carolina, although there was kind of an offshoot that went on over towards Abbeville. But that's where those Scots-Irish came in. That's how John C. Calhoun's family ended up in what's now Abbeville County. That's how Andrew Jackson's family ended up at the Waxhaws in Lancaster. And in addition to those folks from Pennsylvania, Virginians of German and English descent frequently joined the trek because, again, 50 acres of land for everybody in the party. And it was, as we now know, good land, at least for the first few years. In 1740, there were almost no white settlers in the backcountry. By 1775, half the colony's population and 80% of its white population resided there in the backcountry. And as I've already mentioned, among those families immigrating were the Calhouns and the Jacksons. And then there was one very interesting settlement by a congregation in 1772 from Ulster. They were Ulster Scots. And briefly, when you say somebody Scots-Irish, these were Scots who were settled in Ireland by the English because the question there was not race, it was religion. We got to get some Protestant folks over there in that Catholic country. Basically, England was colonizing Ireland with Scots in the northern part of Ireland. Of course, an issue they're still dealing with today. In 1772, the Reverend William Martin was a Presbyterian pastor there. A member of his congregation named Beck, we only know his last name. The local landlord's rent collector appeared at Beck's door while Mrs. Beck was in labor with their first child. The man demanded immediate payment on all money due, then and there, or immediate eviction. Beck literally tossed the tax collector out of the house, but in the process broke the man's neck. Beck's wife and child died. He disappeared. The Reverend Mr. Martin posted a notice on the door of his meeting house about the favorable opportunity to go to South Carolina, where people could enjoy life in abundance with the free exercise of their religious sentiments. 467 families heeded the call. They landed in Charleston and by foot trekked to the Waxhaws and became part of the Scots-Irish settlement there. Frontier settlers were not always welcome. The Reverend Charles Wood Mason, an Anglican missionary, described Scots-Irish as the lowest, vilest crew breathing. Law-abiding residents referred to many of the newcomers as riffraff and Virginia crackers. In official documents, they were described as hunters and squatters, absconded debtors, idlers, gamblers, and unsavory refugees from the northern colonies. And there was tremendous animosity between different groups in the backcountry, between the Baptists and the Presbyterians. And ironically, those two very strong denominations, I have seen the diary, I would rather my daughter marry an Anglican than a Presbyterian. So South Carolina was multicultural in 1775 before the term ever got invented. And I think I'll stop there and we'll continue the saga about immigration next week.